Thanks very much. I'm negotiating this interesting presentation space, so I need a light, and I need this, and I need this. So hopefully all of this will fit together. What I'm going to be doing is largely a response to the paper that was circulated beforehand. That's the 2014 paper, Ticini et al. And I'm aware of the fact that some of the people who worked on that paper are here, but I'm going to use that title because that's the one that's been used for it. So I'm aware that the person, Ticini, is not here, but nonetheless I'll use that title. Also, I'll say a couple of things about the work that the group has been doing since, which came out in José Luis's talk earlier on. So I've modified slightly what I say in light of that. The appreciation of works of fine art, drawings, paintings, works of sculpture, involve an experiential encounter between a receiver and an artifact that results from a process of human making. And we can think of that artifact as the vehicle through which some kind of artistic content gets articulated. I think there are three questions we can ask here about the relationship between facture, the process of making, and the appreciation of artworks. And I think they're three very different questions, although they might seem superficially to be the same. First question is, to what extent does the nature and history of the making of the artistic vehicle of an artwork bear upon the proper appreciation of a work? Second question is, to what extent does an experiential recognition of that vehicle as having had a particular history of making figure in the perceptual engagement with the artifact through which a work is given for appreciation? And the third question is, in what ways, if any, does such an experiential recognition, if it occurs, and any affect attending such a recognition enter into the proper appreciation of the work? Philosophers have had very different answers to these questions. So some have completely dismissed the idea that the making of the artifact through which the content of an artwork is articulated has any bearing on the appreciation of the resulting work. One thinks in particular here of Clive Bell, who famously denies that any information about the history of making of an artifact has any bearing whatsoever on the appreciation of the work that confronts us when we look at that artifact. For Bell, it's merely the effect on us of the formal properties of the resulting artifact that matters. Its history of making has no bearing whatsoever. Other philosophers, however, have gone to the opposite extreme, and in particular, we can find some philosophers who've argued not only for the appreciative relevance of artistic making, but also for the essentially experiential way in which the provenance of a work's vehicle must be given if a full appreciation of the work is to be plausible. This is actually a test for those familiar with the philosophy of art in the audience. And the question is, who said the following? So this is philosophical support for the bearing of acknowledged facture on appreciation. So here are some quotes. What can be painted must stand in some relation to the muscular activity of painting it. The second one is particularly interesting for our purposes. As a consequence, the art of painting is intimately bound up with the expressiveness of the gestures made by the hand in drawing and of the imaginary gestures through which a spectator of a painting appreciates these tactile values. The imaginative content of the work of art comprises the rich qualities of the artist's awareness as he engages in the physical acts of painting. The work itself is the imaginative transformation of the artist's visual sensation of the colours and shapes of his subject, his felt gestures as he manipulates the brush, the scene shape of paint patches that these gestures leave on his canvas. In short, the total sensuous, or rather sensuous emotional, experience of a person at work before his easel. It's this imaginative experience of total activity enjoyed by the painter. You're not allowed to Google it, Dom. No, I thought you were. In his or her physical work on the painting that we as spectators could come to share. If we look at the resulting painting using our imagination, the picture produces in the audience sensuous, emotional, or psychical experiences which, when raised from impressions to ideas by the activity of the spectator's consciousness, are transmuted into a total imaginative experience identical with that of the painter. Anybody identify who that is?
Degree of James?
No.
Hollywood?
Yes, it is. surprisingly, Collingwood. For those who've thought of Collingwood as an idealist, that's about as good a refutation of that view as you can imagine. No, that's R.G. Collingwood. Now, I think most of us are going to resist a little, however sympathetic we are to the idea that facture bears on appreciation, the idea that in looking at a painting we can relive the total imaginative experience of the painter. But even if we resist that idea, some of the ideas expressed by Collingwood here resonate with recent work in cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology that looks at the ways in which evidence of facture in some way affects the way in which people respond to the artifacts through which they engage with artworks. So in particular, that second quote up there, the art of painting is intimately bound up with the expressiveness of the gestures made by the hand in drawing, the imaginary gestures through which a spectator appreciates these tactile values. This seems to resonate with the kinds of things that we've been hearing earlier on about the ways in which some kind of motor simulation of the activity of the artist takes place when we as receivers look at the resulting work and register or somehow represent evidence of facture to be seen in that work. Now, the most extensive work that's been done on these issues about how far recognition of the process of making of an artistic vehicle can affect the ways in which receivers respond to that vehicle. I think the most significant work in this area has been done thus far on dance. And in fact, in Alain Berthoz's talk earlier on, he referred to perhaps the people who've done the most significant work, namely the group of researchers associated with Beatriz Calvo-Merino. And she's provided perhaps the strongest support, at least as respect of dance, for the idea that those who are appropriately trained, or to use the term that was used earlier on, appropriately primed, will in fact respond with something that looks very much from all the evidence to be a motor simulation of the very activity that they're seeing. So Calvino Merino and her researchers actually have looked at, interestingly, neuronal activity and effective response in trained and untrained observers of bodily movements executed by professional dancers. And they've done this research by taking fMRI measurements of brain activity, principally in the premotor cortex, of subjects watching certain kinds of dance movements, taken together with the subject's experimentally expressed preferences for these kinds of movements. This has been offered in support of the claim that observers involuntarily simulate the movements of dancers and that this simulation has positive affect. So the results of measuring the liking or lack of liking of various kinds of simulations as described by the researchers as aesthetic pleasure. So they've regarded this liking as a kind of aesthetic satisfaction. There's some questions about that, but let's assume that's right. What's particularly interesting is that they've carried out not only these kinds of tests with untrained subjects, but they've also looked at the responses of people who have been trained to execute precisely the kinds of dance movements. And there are much, much stronger readings in the fMRI results and also in the effective scores from these subjects as opposed to untrained subjects. So it's even stronger argument for the idea that if you're trained in executing certain kinds of motor routines, then when you observe those motor routines being performed, you in some way simulate them. At least there is activity in the premotor cortex that's consistent with the idea that there's a motor simulation going on. This has led people to think that if this works for dance, then maybe it works in a number of other areas as well. And in particular, it's led to the claims made in the paper by Friedberg and Gallesi that was also referred to earlier today. Claim here is that if the claims about simulation of observed behavior made by researchers working within the broad paradigm established by the work of the Palmer School on mirror neurons in macaques and humans are correct, we might expect to see similar kinds of simulation in those who observe works of visual art. So they offer two hypotheses, two kinds of reports that people make about their experience in looking at works of visual art that they think could be explained if we assume that there is some kind of motor simulation of the activity of the painter taking place at the time that these people look at the paintings. So they say mirror neuronal activity might account for two relationships reported by some observers. First is a relationship between embodied empathetic feelings in the observer and the representational content of the work in terms of the actions, intentions, objects, emotions and sensations depicted. So here the idea is that we can explain people's responses to the content of a painting by saying they're in a sense simulating the very thing represented, and that explains their affective responses to the painting. The second claim is the more interesting one for our purposes, and this is the one that relates directly, I think, to the work done by Ticini et al. Relationship between embodied empathetic feelings in the observer and the quality of the work in terms of the visible traces of the artist's creative gestures, such as vigorous modelling in clay or paint, fast brushwork, and signs of the movement of the hand more generally. So we can extract from that a particular claim. I call it FG2. This is the claim that embodied simulation of the artist's creative gestures occurs when viewing visible traces of such gestures. And I take it that Ticini et al. 2014 are attempting to provide some confirmation for FG2. Ticini et al. Begin their discussion by clearly establishing, I think, how they take their work to relate to FG2. This is the opening paragraph of the discussion section in the paper, and I'm distinguishing two claims here, which I call C1 and C2. C1, our results provide evidence that passive observation of canvases featuring discernible brushstrokes, for example in Seurat's paintings, triggers in the observer's brain the covert simulation of the actions similar to that executed by the artist during the creative act. C1. C2, involuntary simulation causally contributes to aesthetic appreciation. And what I want to do is look at those two claims, and I want to raise some questions about those claims, and I'm raising these in a constructive spirit. I think they're things that, however, need to be addressed. I'm not saying that they're conclusive objections, but I'm saying I think they're issues that need to be addressed. So what I want to do is look at how these two claims, C1 and C2, relate to the existing literature that they seem to somehow bear upon. So in the case of C1, I take the relevant literature to be recent empirical work exploring the neurological and psychological dimensions of our experiential engagement with the vehicles of artworks. That's, for example, the work by Calvo Marino and the claims made by Friedberg and Gillespie. In the case of C2, the literature is philosophical, involving claims about the bearing of aspects of artistic making on the appreciation of works of art. So here I take it as the structure of Ticini et al.'s argument for C1. So let's look at this. We've got this speculation by Friedberg and Gillespie that there is some kind of motor simulation of the activity of the artist that occurs when we look at evidence of facture in paintings. One way you might try to confirm this claim would be by carrying out analogous experiments to the ones carried out by Calvo Marino. These will be fMRI studies of what actually is going on in the brain. And I take it that the work that José Luis was talking about earlier on is an attempt to carry out something like that kind of research relative to that claim. So in other words, it's trying to investigate this claim by looking at what's actually going on in the brain. But the methodology adopted in Ticini et al. 2014 is less direct. The support that their experimental work provides for FG2 rests on the hypothesis that, and this is a quote, if action simulation is causally involved in the affective response to art, subjects would like the artwork in the compatible condition more than in the incompatible condition. So I take it that the support that the experimental work in Ticini et al. Is supposed to provide for FG2 is that FG2 would predict and can explain the observed results of the experiments carried out by Ticini et al. In other words, the argument's got the following structure. If motor simulation were occurring when primed subjects looked at evidence of facture, we would expect this to be reflected in certain differences in affect. There are indeed such measurable and statistically significant differences in affect. This supports the claim that motor simulation is occurring. And I take it that's the argument. Sorry, Bayes. I apologise because I always get really annoyed when people suddenly start dragging Bayes in. So it's just here to make it clear what kinds of things bear on how much support the evidence provides for the thesis, for FG2. And let's call the findings of Ticini et al. The evidence. How much support that provides for FG2 depends not merely on whether it predicts and explains the evidence, but also on whether there are other plausible ways in which we might predict and explain the same evidence. So it's not just a matter of how well FG2 explains the evidence, but how well it explains the evidence relative to alternative hypotheses. And this gets measured by Bayes' theorem. The probability of a theory given the evidence reflects not merely things relating to the theory and the evidence themselves, but also considerations relating to the probability of alternative theories and how far those theories could also explain the evidence. So the larger that thing on the right at the bottom is, the less support the evidence is going to provide, right? The more easy it is for other theories that are plausible theories to explain the same evidence, the less support the evidence will give to the theory we're actually considering. So if we're going to assess the support that FG2 receives from this evidence, we'll need to ask a number of questions. First, what's the prior probability of the idea that motor simulation occurs when we're looking at evidence of Facture? Secondly, the conditional probability of the evidence given FG2, and third, the conditional probability of the evidence given the not FG2. Now, I point this out because I think it needs to be made clear why, in spite of the fact that all these things need to be taken into account, the evidence does provide good empirical support for FG2. And this is, as I say, because the evidence is indirect. If the evidence were the result of neuroscientific research, if we had evidence that there is indeed activity in the premotor cortex in the same areas that seem to be involved in the actual painting, when people look at the paintings, then we could say, well, that's pretty conclusive evidence. If the evidence is indirect and it's based merely on the effective responses, one question is, to what extent could we explain those effective responses, the evidence in the findings, without positing that there's a motor simulation? And in fact, this was something I referred to earlier on. In the paper in Ticini et al. 2014, they acknowledge the possibility that, in fact, the differences in affect, the evidence being offered in support of FG2, could be explained as an artifact in some way of the experimental process. For example, it could be that the things used as primes themselves have an effective valence, so that the thing used for the stippling grip might be a more positive thing than the thing used for the slashing grip, right? So you might say, well, maybe people prefer the combination of the stippling grip and the Quantalist paintings simply because they're already primed to like things by information. There are other things we might say, other ways we might try to explain the evidence without positing a motor simulation. One thing we might suggest is that, in fact, what people like is matching things up, because they've already learnt that it's the stippling grip that produces the Pointilliste paintings. So when they see the stipple grip and the paintings, they match. When they see the slashing grip and the paintings, they don't match. And it seems to me that we can effectively respond to seeing two things that match without necessarily having to engage in a motor simulation. The other worry here is that it's not clear to me that a subject in this experimental condition wouldn't suss out what they're supposed to be looking for. Right? I mean, they're being shown two possible ways of making a painting. They've learnt that this way matches with this kind of painting. You show them this kind of painting, you show them the way in which it's made, and you might say, well, they match, because I know that they seem to be showing me these things. Presumably they're looking at whether I can match up the method with the painting. So there are worries that there are other ways in which we could explain the evidence. And obviously, to that extent, the conditional probability of the evidence given that not FG2 is greater. And if it's greater, then that means that there's not so much support given to FG2 by the experiment. The other question that we might raise is the prior probability of FG2. This is a contentious matter. I won't go there. I suspect most people in this audience are convinced that the mirror neuron research has the credibility it's claimed to have. I only point to a fairly large body of papers that have questioned at least one aspect or another of the mirror neuron research. I don't think you can question in general that there are neurons that function in the way mirror neurons are supposed to function, but if you look at, say, the recent work of Cecilia Hayes and her lab in Oxford, they've called into question the idea that there's any innate basis for mirror neurons. It's purely associative learning, they say. Now, associative learning might be enough in these kinds of cases, but I think we have to be aware of the fact that the credibility of FG2 depends to some extent on the credibility of the Palmer School's work in general and the work that's come out of the Palmer School. There is very positive work that I think should convince us something's going on that needs to be accounted for in the kinds of terms that the Palmer School proposes. Calvo Marino's work, I think, is a very strong evidence that there is at least some kind of mirroring effect that goes on. But I'm only saying that obviously another thing that will affect the overall credibility of this argument is the prior probability of FG2 by itself. A couple of other minor things. I think these, I'll just move to these quickly because I want to get on to something else. I think these are objections that you might raise to the Ticino et al. Paper as evidence for C1, but I think these objections can actually be met. But I'll just mention them, and maybe if anyone wants to discuss them, I can say how I think they can be met. So the first question might be, look, the effective responses are to photographic images of paintings, not to paintings, right? So any effects produced by evidence of facture are mediated by the subject's belief that the things imaged in the photographs bear marks made in a way that either is or is not compatible with the technique imaged. Freeberg and Galeazzi are claiming that it's the marks themselves in the paintings that elicit these responses. So we might want to ask, is the relevant evidence of facture that we would see in looking at the paintings actually preserved when we look at photographs of the paintings? Right? So you might have that worry. I don't think you should. But that's another possible concern. A second is seeing whether we can match the kinds of things that Ticino et al. Claim with the kinds of things that Calvino Marino et al.'s work on dance suggests. And this is the bearing on motor simulation, supposing it occurs, of training, and in particular of having specific training in working in a dance medium or in a visual art medium. So one of the things that's most striking about the work by Calvo Marino et al. Is the difference between the results when you measure activity in the premotor cortex of those who have been trained in executing a particular dance maneuver and when you measure naive observers. So you might say, well, look, there's striking evidence here that there is a real difference here between naive and non-naive subjects, and yet it might seem the claim by Ticino et al. That there's no significant difference between art familiar and art unfamiliar subjects might seem to conflict with that. I think the right answer to this is to say there's two senses of naive here. To be naive in this sense is not to be naive in the sense that bears on the experiment done by Ticino et al. What matters there is whether you've got some experience of using a brush in making certain kinds of marks. And as far as that's concerned, in fact, all the subjects are presumably not naive. They're non-naive in the important sense. And that would seem to be the thing that correlates with the distinction being made by Calvo Marino et al. So I don't think there's a problem with that. But let's come to C2. Right, C2 is the claim that where's the claim? Where's the claim? Right, so I'll go forward one. Involuntary simulation produced in the prime subject by recognizable facture causally contributes to aesthetic appreciation. And the question is, should we accept that claim? And I think there's a number of things here that need to be distinguished. Obviously, one person who will agree with that claim is Collingwood, because Collingwood thinks that to appreciate the work just is to relive the experience of the artist, and you do that by looking at the painting and being encouraged or caused to mentally simulate the activity of the painter himself. So for Collingwood, this claim is fine. But what about for others who think that the history of making of an artifact bears upon its proper appreciation as an artwork? And a number of people have argued this. And these people fall broadly within the camp of contextualists in the philosophy of art. So now we're moving to the way in which the work by Ticini et al. Relates to the philosophical literature on the bearing of facture on appreciation. Contextualists hold aspects of the context in which an artistic vehicle is generated is partly constitutive of the work itself and plays a central role in determining its artistic content. And for at least some contextualists, the artist's achievements in generating the artistic vehicle are among the properly artistic values of the work that must be grasped if the work is to be fully appreciated. So here's a quote by Jerry Levinson. This is broadly what contextualists will say. The pleasure proper to an object as art is one that is fully cognizant of the background from which a work emerges, the process whereby it came to have the exact shape it does, the challenges inherent in the medium and material employed, the problems with which the work is wrestling, and so on. The proper pleasure of art is an informed pleasure and understands that its objects is an artifact, has a history, and represents something done and achieved. The further claim that Levinson makes in subsequent papers, so he clarifies something that might not have been clear there, is that what he calls problem-solving value, that's all this stuff talked about in the middle there, problem-solving value is itself an independent component in a work's artistic value. So if we ask about a work's artistic value, one of the things that gets factored in there, independently of any way it might affect other kinds of values the work has, is the artist's achievement. So I take it that it's this kind of philosopher, somebody who thinks that the artist's achievement plays an essential part in determining the artistic value of a work, who will be interested in the claim that the kinds of responses elicited in those who look at evidence of facture causally contributes to artistic appreciation. So we might say, should a contextualist of this stripe take this as a positive thing and take it on board as something that supports the kind of claims that contextualist makes? Well, the first question, I take it here, is whether and if how making matters for appreciation. So if you're Clive Bell, it doesn't. So first, it's going to be important that in some way you think that the history of making of an artifact counts for the appreciation of the artwork for which it is the artifact, for which it's the vehicle. Notice that this question, does making matter, in the case of the effect on the viewer of evidence of facture. This isn't answered by pointing out that given that the simulatory and effective responses to the recognition of visible evidence of facture is involuntary, it's necessarily causally implicated, right? You might say, well, we can't help it. You know, we look at a painting and necessarily we're affected in a certain way. Well, we are if we've been appropriately primed, right? I mean, that was the point about the priming in the experimental work. But then you might say, well, are we doing people a favour to prime them, right? So the worry here is whether, granted that the perceptual engagements of primed receivers with pointillist paintings have an effective dimension lacking in the engagements of non-primed receivers, does this provide a richer appreciation of the work, or does it distract us from appreciating the work, right? Does this kind of effective response actually bear on the proper appreciation of the work? So the very fact that it's involuntary doesn't actually settle the question. In fact, this is a normative question, a question about what kind of background is appropriate to our engagement with an artistic vehicle if we're going to properly appreciate the artwork for which it's the vehicle. And this actually relates to some work that Dom did with Vincent Bergeron on a related issue, the difference it makes to people's affective responses to musical works if they see the work being performed rather than hear it being performed. And the empirical work shows there are quite radical differences in the expressive value that's ascribed to the work. But that still leaves open the question, if you want to properly appreciate the work, should you just listen to it or should you see it? Right? You don't resolve that question by pointing to the fact that there is a difference. So here again, there's a difference between primed and unprimed receivers. The question is, which kind of receiver is the right one to properly grasp what the work is? So you can't resolve the issue that way. Now we might say, okay, claim is that the involuntary responses, simulatory and affective, of primed receivers to evidence of Facture causally contributes to aesthetic appreciation. There's two ways in which this might work. One, I think, is perfectly reasonable. Unfortunately, I don't think it's what Ticini et al. Are after. So here's the reading that I think is quite correct. You might say, look, affective responses provide evidence of simulation. Simulation provides evidence of Facture, and it's through playing this evidential role that affective response and simulation contribute to appreciation. On this account, the affective dimension of simulation is not a contributory part of our experiential appreciation of the work, but merely evidence of something else that may enter into that appreciation. So this is a sort of fairly minimalist reading of this claim about the causal contribution that simulation makes to appreciation. And I think we should endorse that. I have no problems with that. My worry is with what I take to be the more intended reading. Claims that affective responses to experience Facture enter directly as positive affect into the appreciation of the artwork. If that's the claim, then we're back to the point I just made. Namely, there's certainly a difference in affective response for the primed respondent, but does that actually bear on the proper appreciation of the work? So you can raise that question. I think you can raise another one, and I'm going to come to that. So I'm moving here inexorably towards conclusion, so don't worry. This isn't going to run over. I'm going to set up two other sort of softening up gestures towards the final move I'm going to make. So here are some other ways of raising the kinds of concerns that I have here. First thing is, let's assume that appreciation of artistic making is a crucial element in the proper appreciation of an artwork. Question then is, does maker's knowledge matter? Does the knowledge you would have from being able to do what you take the artist to have done matter? Or can you equally well appreciate from the outside what was done? In other words, is it enough that I know how Pointillis's paintings are produced in order to properly appreciate such a work? Or does experience of performing the relevant actions also matter? So, for example, suppose we showed people, rather than giving them the brushes and getting them to use them, suppose we showed them pictures of artists creating Pointillis's paintings. So these people now have no visuomotor training in actually making these marks, but they know how they're made. Well, then you get them to look at Pointillis's paintings. Is that going to provide as good a background for properly appreciating those paintings as the people who've been given this experience in actually making the marks with brushes? So does maker's knowledge matter? Second question is it plausible to think that the satisfaction a receiver experiences in perceiving evidence of Facture bears upon the proper appreciation of the work? So suppose I do affectively respond to evidence of Facture. Is it plausible to say that that satisfaction I get from observing evidence of Facture has any part to play in the proper appreciation of the work, right? Are there reasons to think it might not? One thing to bear in mind is that if we think of the value of an artwork depending in part upon its history of making, on its provenance, on Facture, then it isn't the fact that an artwork was made that gives it value. It's the way it was made, right? So when we say that Facture bears on appreciation, what we mean is particular features of the ways something is made bear upon its proper appreciation as an artwork. So it's the nature of what the artist has done or what the artist achieves in her activity that's relevant. So if you ask what role then does evidence of facture play here, it feeds into our attempts to come up with some kind of understanding of what was done, of the artist's achievement. Now, that evidence can come from something that's visible to us when we look at the painting, or it can come from reading about how the painting was created. All of these things will provide evidence of the process of making. How this bears upon appreciating the work will depend upon what we take to have been achieved through that process of making. So it's not facture per se that bears on artistic value. It's the achievement we take to have occurred through what we take to be the process of making that bears upon appreciation. And Levinson suggests here we appreciate this in terms of challenges an artist's project presents, how the artist overcomes these challenges, originality and ingenuity involved in such solutions, how this furnishes new practical resources for the medium, and the historical context in which this making occurs. The model here that a lot of us have found very helpful is Michael Baxendale's model in his book Patterns of Intention, where he suggests that we think about a work of visual art as, and indeed an artifact in general, as a solution to a problem in a situation, right? We try to understand what the situation was within which the artist was working, and then we can appreciate the artist's achievement by seeing how the artist has come up with solutions to the various challenges presented by the artistic enterprise in that context. So it might be said visual evidence of facture only bears upon artistic appreciation insofar as it enters into such a reconstruction and assessment of the artist's doing. This goes back to the first reading I gave earlier on as to what the causal relationship is between visible facture and artistic appreciation. The idea that it's a purely evidential issue, that what we get are the affect provides evidence of the simulation provides evidence of facture, and it's that evidence of facture that gets factored into our general attempt to come up with an account of what the artist did and therefore what the artist's achievement is, and it's that that bears on appreciation. So my final suggestion. Here's a question. Insofar as an appreciation of the artist's achievement is an essential part of the appreciation of her work, does the value of that achievement contribute to the value of the work through the experiential value of either the process itself as experienced by the artist or our experience of recognizing the process, right? So what I want to suggest is that if we think that the artist's achievement is one of the things that enters into our assessment of artistic value, it's, as I suggest down here, it's our intellectual recognition of the qualities of what the artist did, rather than the experiences produced in us when we reflect on what the artist did, that bears upon appreciation. Right? So where I'm experientially affected by what I take an artist to achieve, I would claim my response is prompted by a recognition of a value that the achievement has. Right? It's because the achievement has value that bears upon the artistic value of a work that I might be affected emotionally by it. It's not because I'm emotionally affected by it that this achievement has artistic value. So what I want to do is distance concerns about the role of the artist's achievement in artistic value from any experiences that might be produced in us, either by evidence of facture individually, or indeed by our awareness of the particular kind of thing that the artist has achieved. I don't think that this kind of value is an experiential value. Now, there are larger debates here in the philosophy of art about whether all artistic value is experiential value. I think achievement properties are a good argument that it's not, and that when we appreciate what an artist achieves, it's not in virtue of how we experience it. It's in virtue of that achievement recognized in terms of, as I say, its qualities as a thing having been done. And if we admire it, that's because of what's been done. It's not that what's been done is good because we admire it. It's a good Platonic argument to finish up with. So basically, that's it. Thanks.